What would happen to your business if you shut off all your ad spend and you turned off every single discount? What would be left? Well, the good news is you don't actually have to turn off anything because we have Preston joining us. This is the second time he's been on the podcast, the first ever two-time guest, because the first time he was on, it was the most listened to episode I've ever had. And it's by no mistake. This man actually knows what he's talking about. He has built a 9-figure business that he exited in Chubbies and then has advised so many other brands. So many times I'm talking to a brand that we work with and they're like, oh yeah, we're talking to Preston. We know Preston. It's because he's doing it right now. Preston breaks down why brands are crushing it a decade later while others seem to fizzle because they can't escape this sort of ROAS feedback loop, this short-term, how do sales look today and tomorrow sort of feedback loop. We also discuss the word brand because sometimes it can just feel like the wind, this ethereal and tangible thing. And we talk about all the ways that it can be measured and why that matters. So I wanted to start with a story. One of the most maddening moments I have ever had with a partner because I could not explain to them how else to look at this. We had a campaign we created for them and they had spent $1 million behind it, right? And the ROAS that they received on it, let's just say hypothetically was a 2, right? And I asked him, are you going to continue to invest in these ads with us? This is one of your top performing ads on Meta currently. And he says, well, I cannot convince my CFO to continue to invest in video because I invested $1 million behind this photo over here and it did a 2.02 ROAS. So I'm not making this up. He's like, so how do I explain to somebody why I would spend more on video when this photo is performing just as well, if not outperforming, right? In short term, in ROAS. And my mind went to, if you quantify the amount of time people have spent with your brand, learning about your brand from this video, they are a higher quality, much more educated consumer. And if they have bought, now they can explain to someone how it works, why it works, all the things. Whereas someone who comes through, they might have bought, they don't have all that information. And so I've seen this trend over and over again. I remember when Dr. Squash came back to us and said, it's interesting, the LTV on our YouTube buyers are so much higher than the ones coming from TikTok. And I'm like, not shocking. Someone watched a 3 to 5 minute video before they got there. Preston, you've been living this world of like, how do you have that conversation with the CFO to be like, even if they were anywhere near each other, we should be doubling down on storytelling and on brand building, even if, let's say there's actually a 0.3% ROAS, a 0.3 ROAS difference, right? I'd love your reaction to that story and what you're trying to solve right now in this marketing and advertising world.
Yes. What a story. And oh my gosh, how many times have I lived that, felt that, experienced it? And I would think that most of the people listening to this podcast, whenever they watch it, have had a similar experience themselves, right? Okay, so let me first just say, I was the person who would have gone with the static for many years. We started Chubbies in late 2011, and we were that for the first 5-6 years of the business. And to be honest, in a lot of ways it worked, but those were different times, first of all, from the perspective of like competition in the auction and cost of ads in general, right? The notion of like running at a 2 ROAS back in 2013 is like, you are the advertiser if you got to cut it out, you are the worst advertiser on the face of this earth.
My mom's
Why aren't
listening.
You getting an 8?
I'm so glad you corrected that cuss word.
Is this like a clean family show?
No, I was messing with you.
Oh, I want to make sure, honestly, because I was on another podcast and I said a word, and I think he prefaced it with like kids or parents. Like if you have kids in the car, like tell them.
Oh my gosh! Oh my gosh! You know what? Good point. Man, you know what? And I'm not cutting this out, by the way, because if you're listening to this podcast with your kids in the car, what's wrong with you? Like, they don't want to listen to marketing people love on their way to school. All right.
Good point. All right. Let's bring it back. So different time, right? Okay. But then it's not just because the good old days are no longer the good old days. No, it's because it was not working the whole time. We just didn't lift our heads up to understand what truly was happening in the business. Okay. So I'm going to focus this on just D2C e-com, and then we'll talk omnichannel after that. For D2C e-com, one of the things that a listener might either be seeing or might want to look into after listening to this conversation is like, what is the revenue I'm just getting if I were to turn off discounts? What is the revenue I'm getting if I were to really dial down my ad spend? What is the revenue I'm getting if I were to just like shut off everything? For a lot of brands and for Chubbies, that was going down and down and down and down, even as ROAS was going up, right? So there's this fundamental disconnect between fundamental business success and ROAS, where you can, in theory, take ROAS to any number you want. If you were to toggle amount spent, how you're going to target, retargeting existing customers, brand keyword spend, whatever it might be. Or you could just run a bunch of crazy discounts. Like if I were to just take my $100 product and charge $1 for it, ROAS would be crazy, right? Because people would buy all of them right away. So therein lies an issue where it's just sort of like, number one, should we be making decisions purely off of ROAS in the first place? I have learned that the answer to that is no. Not that you ignore it, but that it is one of the factors. Two, so for the folks that we've been in this game for a long time. I'm no longer in the game since I'm out of the business, but Chubbies is crushing it. And it's 13, 14 years later. For the brands who are crushing it 13, 14 years later, they have all gone this path of putting ROAS into context, figuring out how to do things that get people to feel, to pay attention, that allow you to keep rising above the noise. All of these things that you're just not able to do if you're optimizing on short-term ROAS. Fundamentally, like there's no disagreement there. Like you can't, I can look at anyone's ad account right now and I'll look at the ones that are top to bottom, highest ROAS to lowest, that got some min spend, and none of them, 99% of them will not be something that as a founder, as an operator, you truly feel really good about putting out into the world. It's oftentimes, and it might feel okay. It might be a fancy image, but it is not the thing that you're like, yes, this is us. I want this to be associated with me. No, it's like product offer urgency. And not that that's bad, but you can't do one without the other. Unfortunately, that is just a fact. That is the reality. And so then it's kind of like, okay, these are the truths. These are the facts. This is just what happens with brands that make it. They step out of the, dare I say, myopic perspective of evaluating everything on a short term, right? And they start thinking about balance, right? They start thinking about, I need that video and I need the static. My video is going to make my static work better. Without the video, my static will get less and less effective. It's just math, right? Facebook earnings just came out yesterday. Perfect example. Cost per ad up 11% year over year. So like you've had to find 11% somewhere to fight that. Or you're just paying 11% more to get the same amount, right? There is no debate. Those are just numbers. That is the actual publicly available financial data from Meta, the person or the platform on which most of us are spending most of our dollars. So like, what do we do with that, right? It is ultimately channel tactic creative, but predominantly creative.
I'm actually going to pause you right there because I'm like, I think the way you have set this up is the fundamental reality. And I think it's like most people, I feel this sometimes where it's like there's a disconnect between my head and my heart. And I feel like when it comes to building your company and building brand. Now we can measure brand. Like I think to your point, the brand can be measured. It can be measured in awareness, which is real. Like it is very real. Like as I have watched and been part of brands that went from 1% to 20% to 50%, unaided brand awareness in the country. Their sales went from, 5 million to 200 million to a billion, right? I have seen it, my own two eyes, multiple times. I'm like, I get that this is real and it is a cumulative effect. And that if I had $100 million to spend on advertising, and one of them involved being in the Super Bowl and one of them involved converting an extra 30, $40 million worth of customers, in the short term, you're like, oh yeah, I would want more customers. In the long term, you're like, no, I want more people to know about my brand because that will impact me for years to come. Like, no short term, big long term. What I'm trying to say is we all kind of get it. So what are you, other than turning off your ads and seeing what continues to come in, what should people be thinking about? What are
Yeah.
the options and tools available to people that are like, yes, you're preaching to the choir, I am with you, but now what? What do I do?
Yeah. Lovely question. And I'll start with you have no tools. What can you do right now? Because there's a lot you can do. Number one is just break down your revenue into 3 pieces. Just pop into GA, and to the extent you're an e-com business, and to the extent
Google Analytics for those of you out there.
Google Analytics, and pop into Google Analytics, and just break your revenue into 3 pieces. 1, baseline. So baseline, define it in any variation of the following, but revenue from organic search, direct, organic social referral. We can talk about how you're going to up level it to take out the influences from things like discounts and spend like that. Number 2, triggered. Email, SMS. Pretty easy to do, right? You've UTM'd things to the extent you've UTM'd things. So just, do that. Part number 2. Part number 3, paid. That can be the simplest way to do it is just that's everything else. Now, everyone, as you get more sophisticated, you get a more sophisticated definition of what paid revenue is. But that's a place to start. Break your revenue into 3 pieces. Look at the last 6 months, do a year-over-year comp. Look at your revenue per session by those 3 groupings, and just tell me what you see. 90% of brands are going to see that all of their growth year over year came from paid. The revenue per session of the paid traffic is half that of baseline, and it's trending down, and their baseline is either flat or declining. So then if you start thinking about just basic math, all of my growth is not margin accretive. So overall contribution margin of the business generally is going down. Most everyone listening to this, if you're running a modern D2C com brand or even multi-channel, you're running into these headwinds. So that would be the first thing. Is my baseline growing as fast as my paid? If yes, you're doing something right. And I would imagine it's a brand who chose to spend against both that video and that static. Very basically. Number 2, get a little bit more sophisticated. Strip out the impact of your paid and of triggered and big discount events on baseline. So you get to a more resilient version of a baseline, which can kind of replicate your kind of SaaS subscription type, that revenue that's just always there. One way of saying it, and I actually it's a little bit, it's not super correct, is just this notion of the customer acquisition you still have and you turn everything else off kind of thing. But it's simply a hyperbolic way to kind of think about it, given that we've all had.
It gives you a baseline without actually having to turn off your ads, is what you're saying.
Totally. Yeah, exactly. Which freaks us all out. Because we
it's also
all
just a bad move in many ad accounts, but
bad move. Now, there are pulse tests, right? We can do pulse tests. We can do a bunch of these sorts of things to understand true business lift, obviously. But everyone kind of knows that if I were to just switch off all my discounts, all my promos, and really dial down ads, I might not have a business. I think a lot of us have this feeling once we get to a certain scale. And I think what's happening is that it's happening to brands at a smaller and smaller revenue amount. This fear that if I were to turn these things off, things would dwindle really quickly and I might not be able to cover my OpEx, and that's when things get really scary, right? When you don't have a bit, you do have to fire people, or you do have to sublease your space, or you do have to turn all of your inventory into cash if that is the case. And there's a non-zero chance that stuff, could happen. Anyways.
Now that everyone that's already having nightmares as a entrepreneur or CMO is now sweating, continue, Preston.
So yes. So then there's also some tools. I mean, you can use, to your point, you can use brand awareness surveys. You can do the survey thing. And we did that at Chubby's, probably still do. I'm not in the day-to-day, but useful, right? I mean, what's going on with people? Ask them questions, right? That's how it's been done. Downside, for smaller brands or even for bigger brands who are just running media in a way that is inconsistent with a world where surveys made a ton of sense, which is like, I'm changing budgets. I'm changing channels, tactics, creative, like almost on the daily. It's hard, right? To then understand what I just did, really drove unaided from X to Y. So, but it's still great. But the downside is that it can be expensive if you're paying on a per survey basis. There could be, right, there are problems with every way of measurement. But then there are some things that we kind of discovered at Chubby's, when we almost went out of business after being obsessed with the short-term ROAS.
Okay. So that's actually a perfect,
it was kind of maybe the thing we want to talk about.
Yeah. So many of our listeners will not have necessarily the context for what that journey and moment looked like. So if you want to give us like the very quick, Ghost of Christmas Past, Ghost of Christmas Present, Ghost of Christmas Future version of Chubby's and their dance with this question and how you all solved for it. And then I'll ask you my next question about how are you helping other brands to figure out the same thing.
Perfect. The brief story, 4-stage brand life cycle that I've learned we all go through some version of, now that I'm almost a decade and a half into it, I've seen a lot of brands. Phase 1, classic, we picked a good niche. We have a product that's differentiated. We don't have money, so we do some cool stuff to rise above the noise. Pretty much all of our revenue is from some version of organic. Awesome. At that stage, we're like, I will never spend money on advertising. I will never discount. And honeymoon phase, right? But you've done some good stuff, right? You've shown that you can rise above. Stage 2, you start dabbling with some spend, and then all of it is just crazy incremental and crazy high ROAS, because you're tapping into this latent demand that you still haven't exhausted yet. Like you still have such a full funnel. That's stage 2. Maybe you're like, okay, maybe I'll do like a bundle. And I'll give 10% off to just be an AOV driver on my site. You start to do some of these things, but you're scaling, you're an organization. This was like our stage 2. We start to have employees, financial forecasts, a board of directors, these things where it's like, okay, I got to systematize. Then you just kind of like keep going in that direction around like optimizing around, we're very data driven, right? Everything is objective. Everything is backed by some metric. Oh, ROAS. This is awesome metric. This is great. Yeah, I'm going to go off of CPA. I'm going to go off of ROAS. And if it doesn't show up in platform, it doesn't exist. And that's how how we operated for some time. And then like stage 3, like you realize this is not working anymore. Kind of pick your head up and just kind of like, oh my gosh, vast majority of my growth or of my revenue, no less, is coming from paid. Like I'm buying transactions. I'm effectively convincing people with product offer urgency to buy, like on a rational level. I've lost the ability to just have people search Chubby's shorts as part of their purchase process, when they come in market, 95/5 rule, which we talked about in the last podcast. Listen to the other podcast. And then it's sort of like, wow, okay, I've started to actually like operate on a contribution margin type basis, and I'm realizing that it's trending down, and I'm like, oh my gosh, what is this business? I've been doing this for like better part of a decade. Like, what do I have here? So you've got those like existential moments, and then you're kind of like up against the wall, and you've all in the back of your head, you've got like this dirty word that is brand marketing, that is like just non-accountable wasted money. If you were anything like me.
It's the woo woo. It's the art, not the science. It is.
Yeah, it's the John Hamm Mad Men.
Oh man,
3 martini lunch.
I hate it. I hate it, and I love it because it really is. It's like, how do you describe something that's real that you can't necessarily see, taste, touch, or smell, but it's real? It's like love. It's like it's like the spirit. It's like the wind. Although you can kind of feel the wind. I'm serious. Like my
Yeah.
son once asked me, he goes, "Dad, why can't I see God?" And I said, "Well, why can't you see wind?" And he was like, "Good point." And so I kind of feel like brand is like, well, we all know it's real, but for some reason it is highly intangible. So, but yeah.
Is it would be my response,
Oh
right?
gosh, here we are. You're like, is it? Well, I mean, yeah, it
We
lives in
could
the hearts
try.
and minds
Yeah.
of many people.
Yeah. Yeah. It I mean, yes. Yes, the brief thing I would say is we pay for stuff. Like perceived value, I think, is one way to think about this. Right? Is there's no debate that if
Yep.
you can charge more for something, you have a stronger brand holding constant features, product, everything else. Like that's like, what is that? That is intangible, right? That is someone making an emotional decision to pay more of their money, to allocate more of their resources to a thing that has not changed objectively at all. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
So I
Hmm.
don't know. That is the wind. That
Hmm.
is human decision making. That is gravity. Whatever. So, anyways, stage 3. We're like freaking out, and unfortunately, like very seriously, had to like reset the business. Had to unfortunately like let go of great people, and that's like very sad and very embarrassing. And I had to like reset the brand, and not like a branding reset, like the company and who we are, like not who we are necessarily, but like how we're going to operate. And then just fast forward, like stage 4 is this notion of balanced growth. There's this notion of balance of branded performance. This notion of, maybe we're not ROAS maximizers. Maybe we're even ROAS minimizers. Or maybe we start thinking about different data that we care about. We start understanding, hey, I want to drive short term. I want to be as efficient as possible in the short term. But I also want a lot of high quality, resilient, organic traffic, ideally from brand search, where people are just seeking me out because my brand means something to them. It's an immediate automatic thought when they come in market for my category. That you learn is just really important. Like you
Hmm.
just learn that from like an equity value perspective. Public markets, very easy. Like all this data exists. Public markets, the general idea that I can dial down spend and gush more cash is how companies are valued. And that's it. Like listen to Warren Buffett. Like, just I have the ability to raise prices faster than inflation every year. That is a strong brand. If you have that, you've got a sustainable moat. Like there's just no debate. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
So it's these sorts of things. That's kind of like where we started to get with Chubby's once we realized how being out of balance didn't work. It's not like we stopped trying to drive short-term efficiency. No. But it was just more of a spreading of focus to, yes, this matters, but I also need to be building this organic base or building this resilient base, this like layer
And so
cake.
what did that look like practically? Like when you made that decision, what did you tangibly start doing differently?
Yeah. So there was something called Facebook analytics. So we were always data driven, and let me just say this, we were always data driven. We never just boop. That was not something we could
For
do.
those of you that couldn't see that, he just licked his finger and put it into the air to
Oh, yeah.
feel the wind, which, as we've established, is basically like trying to feel the brand in the air.
Oh, God, that's good. You're right. Some people aren't watching. That's right. Good point. So we we had to kind of tweak, but we were always direct response, one day click performance marketers. Right.
Mhm.
We just changed the clicks that we tracked and how we valued the click. That makes sense. Meaning, yeah, we were still trying to drive those buy now clicks, and we were trying to drive that purchase in a day behavior. Yep. And we were also trying to drive people to engage on our ads, very basically, to like, share, comment, whatever, follow off of our ads,
Mhm.
off of our paid stuff, and organic, of course. But it's getting harder and harder to get organic reach, engagement, et cetera,
Right.
et cetera.
It's as a business, you
Yeah.
got to pay for that reach.
Yeah, generally. Like if it's going to do something that is not purely virality for virality's sake, which I'm not going to say is bad, but to only do that, we
It's
tried
our
it
playbook.
and it
Yep.
just doesn't work. But if you, on a portfolio level, if you've got a balance of it, I think that totally is totally cool. But if you're talking at all about like a product in any sort of way, explicit or implicit, or a company or anything, right? I mean, it's just hard to do it. But it might not get massive reach, but it might get engagements. It might get lots of saves. It might get lots of shares. It might still be interesting to folks who are seeing this content. But the algo is not necessarily optimizing for what you're optimizing for. They're optimizing for time spent, which is not necessarily what you're optimizing for as an individual account, an individual brand. Okay, so that is sort of like that. You mentioned like tactically what we then did. So like we didn't change to become quote unquote brand marketers, like this whole thing that we were just talking about, where it's like, okay, I'm going to do this massive, one-off thing. And who, again, lick the finger, put it in the air. It's pretty still heavily meta, just using it differently. Meta, TikTok, and other, YouTube, whatever, the digital platforms that we know and love, and CTV and other stuff, but like still the bread and butter. And like tactically, luckily we had a lot of organic content that we hadn't boosted in the past, because we thought the algo will take care of it, right? If it's good, it'll go. And, we learned that was not necessarily the case, especially as we wanted to evolve our content to be like 4 things. Yes, it engages. It somehow mentions the brand, somehow, explicitly, implicitly, distinctive brand assets, Sonic, whatever you were saying, cool term. And 3, somehow connects to what you sell, in some form. Mostly implicit, but like you can be explicit because your product is also brand building. And then 4, like why you? Why me versus some other brand? Do that to varying degrees, but it's got to do all of them if you're going to actually turn the content into money at some point. That's what we learned. And so that being the case, that is not going to go viral necessarily. Okay, so the tactics. Boosting organic posts, like a lot. And consistently. The right posts, et cetera, but just putting money behind organic content. 2, putting more brandy content in conversion optimized ad sets. Like I'm speaking very much like TikTok meta direct response performance marketing, because that's what it still was,
Yeah,
just
I mean, look,
responses.
you're living the life of, we use the term brand formants. Like
Yes.
it's on our homepage, where we're like, to us, we think it's a silly. I still think it's a silly question when someone says branding or performance. I'm like, it can be both. I can prove it to you because I've seen it happen over and over and over and over again. And I think it's like anything. I think what I will say, I think what happens is 2 things. One is people try it and they don't get the immediate results they look for, and they get discouraged. That's 1.
Oh yes,
2,
definitely.
Doing anything that's like brand formance related that actually requires like being interesting, to your point, like creating interesting content, not just an ad with a promo code offer or a static, takes a lot more time and energy. It just does, or more money, because you're probably hiring either a team internally or an external team. It's like, someone said this last weekend. I was at a Ezra Firestone's mastermind.
Oh, sweet.
And someone said, I was like, it's such a good reminder. It was like, a lot of times what we need to do is simple, but it doesn't make it easy. And I'm like, yeah, like if we make content that people genuinely want to consume and interact with, it will have a net positive result on our sales over time. It just will. It's like, but it everyone wants that deluge moment, and those things do happen, right? They do happen. They happen with True Classic Teas. It's happened with Dr. Squatch. It's happened with Lumi. It's happened with some of these brands, Bones Coffee, where all of a sudden, Shady Rays. I keep going, where it's like, okay, yes, they get the ad that lines up with the channel that people watch and convert on at the same level or a similar level as their best performing UGC asset, but now they're building brand and selling at the same time. And that gets, now when they throttle that ad, they just get so much more stickiness in people's minds out of it than they would otherwise. I also see this with celebrity driven campaigns. A lot of people are really negative on celebrity driven campaigns because they don't provide the immediate returns. And I was one of those people that was like, not a believer until I talked to, if you listen to the podcast, I talked about this moment a lot, where I talked to Chris from Manscaped, and he was talking about how they, and same thing with Dr. Squatch, where it's like, done hundreds and hundreds of millions in sales. And I have no doubt that like 3 years from now, someone's gonna be like, did you make the Sydney Sweeney ad? Which we didn't. We didn't. Right. But I'm like, because people just remember celebrities in the strangest ways with these brands that like, no, it probably had no difference in their immediate sales lift. And no, it looks probably like a big loss in the moment. But I'm like, I'm telling you right now, I know they could afford to take that risk, and it was worth it. Now, a lot of people have different opinions on it, and same thing with like the Snoop Dogg solo stove thing. And I'm like, it's like, okay, like
Crushed it. Yeah.
it was like it depends on how you look at success. But I'm like, a lot of people talked a lot more about solo stove last year than they did the year before that, and
Dude, yeah.
no, it had no immediate lift on sales. In fact, it didn't have a lift in sales this year either, but it definitely took the brand awareness up a lot. And eventually, they may be able to convert that. You can't convert a customer who's not aware of who you are. It's just like it doesn't exist. So all
Mm.
this being said, definitely a big fan of this idea that you're getting at with like, sometimes it just means taking a look and be like, okay, what if we tried a little bit harder to infuse brand into our storytelling? That's basically what you're saying. It's like, well, you're running ads
Yeah.
anyway. What
Right.
if we just made them a little bit more interesting and provided more personality? What if? It's like, but that would take
Right.
a lot more energy than what we're probably putting in right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
Take more
Yeah.
energy. And it's hard. I mean,
If it was
and then
easy, everyone would be doing it all the time.
yeah. Yeah,
Yep.
exactly. And so yeah, that very much like those are the tactics. It wasn't crazy. And the great thing is like intuition has gotten a bad rap in the same way that the word brand has, right? The reality is that our gut, our intuition has like crazy insane pattern recognition, is processing a ton of objective data in a way that is way more powerful than some, easy spreadsheet that we run and we process every week to report on our media spend.
Yep.
That's just true. Like, that's just a fact, So, like, I think a lot of this is also, and the CFO would be like, blah, 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 intuition. But and we could talk about like the CFO angle as well. But this notion that like everything our feeling is meaningful. You know what I mean? And like as buyers of anything, we feel certain things, right? And to just ignore that, I think is very sad, and it is myopic. And I think as you graduate to these different stages, I think everyone gets to this point where they realize like intuition's right. It's about a balance, right? I got to clear the bottom of the funnel. I got to effectively fill the funnel. Meta's not going to fill the funnel by just me allowing them to do it themselves. They're going to do it, but they also have to optimize for the thing that they're optimizing for that makes them more money in the short term. And they'll just cycle through advertisers. They're fine with that, right? And so like these are just the realities of the dynamics at play. So like we cannot assume, right? Because we know that we're not going to reach all of the people that we're going to need to reach, because not all of them are very likely to click on an ad and purchase within your attribution window. That is just a fact, right? You're going to be able to reach a lot of people if you've got different objectives and different content types. And it's not totally true, I would say, and I could be wrong, that creative is the new targeting, right? You actually have to like do different objectives, I think. But I think it's like a crawl, walk, run, right? So I think the way to practically get there is not to just jump all the way to the brandiest of the brandy brand things. I think it is to just like stick with your conversion optimized campaign and just start feathering in slightly that video that does like 0.001 worse. Worse is also not a word I should use. Different. But like start feathering that kind of stuff in, and you get a little bit more confident that and then you're like, okay, yeah, I will take 0.05 lower ROAS because I know this is doing a lot. And then you can objectively be like, okay, like how's my brand search volume? Like is there any lift there? And you'd even consider like a custom conversion event of an organic search, right? Optimize towards that. And that'll clearly show you what type of creative, is better. And that'll open you up to brand new audiences if we're just talking like meta advertising.
Yeah.
So anyways, there are all these tactics that make it pretty easy to just like do this crawl, walk, run transition. But at the end of the day, it's all about, is there a problem to solve? A brand has to agree that there is a problem. And then what is the problem? If you don't agree that there's a problem, then it's not even worth having this sort of like balance or even bringing up the word brand. You know what I mean? And what is the problem? Like I talked about it at the beginning, but it's just like, how's my profitability? Am I growing faster at a higher profit margin? If so, you don't have a problem. Am I growing slower and my profit margins going down? Then you do have a problem. Very simply, right? And then you can break into like what the problem is. But if you're an e-com business and you're heavily direct response and you're heavily off of short-term ROAS, your problem is probably manifesting in more of your revenue coming from paid, decreased effectiveness, efficiency, or return on the dollars you're spending. And you probably have a smaller and smaller organic business than you had prior. And like truly organic, like truly baseline, like uninfluenced.
Yep.
And like to the extent everyone is on board with this notion of a problem, then we can start having a conversation of like, now what, right? But
Yeah.
that's sort of like do we have a problem, and then articulating it, I think, effectively in a way that even the CFO is on board, right? I mean, they want more contribution dollars. They want to drop more cash to the bottom line.
Maybe brands are doing this really well and need a way of tracking it to then bring it back to their leaders and say, hey, we need to continue to invest in this, or we need to invest
Correct.
more heavily in this. Look at the results. What have you been developing? What are people right now piloting at the time of this recording? I'd love for you to share this with the world.
Yeah, let's do it. So what is it? It's 10:51 Pacific time on October 31st, 2024, as of the time of recording. And it is, so very basically, it's an attempt to solve a lot of the problem stuff that we've been talking about in this conversation. This notion of I'm seeing some of this diminished performance in my business. Maybe profit margin's going down. I'm not growing as fast. I'm getting less for every dollar spent on paid. What do I do? I have this grand vision for my brand. What we learned, and we experienced this firsthand at Chubby's, when we were in that stage 3 of like, oh my gosh, we need to change, what we ultimately backed into was this kind of like balance of brand and performance. But it was less that. It was like, how do I drive actual growth in top line and bottom line in an effective, systematic way? And it necessarily required that we got away from optimizing everything on a short-term ROAS basis. So then what? Because this is still a measurement problem. We're still data-driven businesses. What we're doing with this company, this platform, whatever you want to call it, called Marathon, is helping to help like brands just like the modern D2C multi-channel brands that we're all working with and love and buy from and are working at, how to think about brand building in a performance marketing way, very basically, so that you can build not only your short term and still keep crushing that, but also, build that long-term base of revenue that we all know is so important. This notion that I can still I have high quality money coming in regardless of the situation, regardless of the performance of the algorithm on any given day. I can reduce price sensitivity, do all of the good things, but ultimately drive more of my money that is higher margin. And so that's what we've been working on. Gosh, it's been about 1.5 years, and we just started bringing on a small number of brands in maybe the last 2-3 weeks, which has been crazy, but overwhelmingly positive reception. It's just wild. Like clearly there is this tension of like, I know I need to do this brand stuff, but since I don't know how to measure it, I can't invest in it, or I can't invest enough in it in a systematic way. And that's a problem we're trying to solve, because we found firsthand, and as we've looked at all of the brands in our cohort, over the last 15 years that are crushing, 9, 10 more figures at 15, 20% EBITDA margins, right? This is how they operate, and they've found ways to do it. And effectively, all we're trying to do is take a lot of the stuff that they've really been doing and make it available.
The hard work
to
that they
brands.
figured out.
Hard work that they figured out, or they're working with like consulting, marketing mix, or long-term brand modeling firms that charge you 10 figures a year and you give you 2 readouts a year. Like, this stuff exists. We're just like taking the technology and applying it to brands of our sizes. You know what I mean? But are also like running different media every single day, changing budgets every single day, testing, doing all of this other stuff, dominating on the short term too. So like trying to solve that problem, because it was so impactful for us at Chubby's to help us get out of this obsession with short-term ROAS into this balanced approach. And it had all the other effects. Like, it made our DR more efficient. Like, it made our email more efficient. Like, it does all the stuff that in theory you think about. We're just trying to like take the whole, like, I got to make this huge leap of faith data-wise, and just be like, no. Here's just like your brand ROAS, like here's how your ads and your organic social posts are making you money in the form of long-term, like, resilient baseline revenue, which is like, we're also trying to build that too. So anyways, that's the objective of Marathon, and marathondataco.com is the website. You didn't ask me to plug it or whatever, but
I was going to plug it for you. So I'm glad you did. I'm glad you did. I mean, look, I feel like if you're at this point in this journey. Maybe you've listened to the previous. My previous podcast with you, Preston, was one of the most listened to of all time.
No way,
on
that's
our
awesome.
show, and I think people appreciate that this is something that you and I have actively worked on in our careers, in a very real way that most people haven't experienced. I think a lot of people think of brand and they think of State Farm and Nike and
Right.
Pepsi and Coca-Cola. And I'm like, that's great, but that's not the game.
Right.
There's Apple. Like, we're not playing that game.
Different.
Like, I'm a 50 million or 100 million or $250 million brand that like might have 20% unaided brand awareness. How do I operate in that ecosystem where my product may or may not be available at every store all the time in all the ways for 100+ years? Right.
Yeah.
So it's like, we're playing a different game here. Who's going to be on our team and on our side to help us figure it out? Because we all agree that brand is as real as the wind, but we don't all know how to necessarily harness and track it.
That's right.
So I would say at this point in the journey, if someone is interested, they should at least check out the demo on the website because that's free. And why wouldn't you? So yeah. Marathon.co, correct?
Marathondataco.com. It's one of those like
Marathon
we didn't have a lot of money to pay for an expensive.
.com.
Yeah,
My
marathondataco.com. It's now the with this podcast, maybe it's the not so private beta, but still keeping it, keeping it small. We're trying to work with brands who are probably the best fit and that we can work really closely with. But yeah, just general idea being like, let's make your intuition concrete and then allow you to run your media in the same way you always have been, but just probably starting to run creative you feel better about. More raindrop type creative, probably. I don't know. But just better creative generally, because you're seeing what you were missing, which is that, hey, this great creative was driving a lot of value that I was missing. I intuited it. Now I have some semblance of data to show me that so that I can find balance. Like that's what we learned is true performance marketing is balance. You're growing your baseline and you're growing your paid. And you got to be in balance if you want to like get to these levels where we all want to get.
I feel balanced having talked with you. Namaste, Mr. Rutherford. I appreciate you being on the show.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for having me, Jacques. This is always fun.
All right, that's what we have for you today on Marketing People Love. If you loved this podcast, 2 things you should do. 1, subscribe so you never miss another episode. And 2, make sure you check out Preston. He's very active on LinkedIn, one of my favorite people I follow there. And that's where you can find a little bit more information on his new SaaS product he's working on and just his wisdom in general. So make sure you check him out on LinkedIn.